Just waiting for the last few to come into the room, but those of you already with us, if I haven't met you yet, I am Anna Burley. I am the Co-operative Party's Policy Officer and your host for this lunchtime. It is lovely to see so many of you, some familiar faces and some new faces, so hello and welcome to everybody. I've lost track of how many of these we've done now. I feel like I spend my life in front of Zoom, but this is our first with Jonathan Reynolds, who is the Labour and Co-operative MP for Stalybridge and Hyde and newly made the Shadow Secretary of State for Work and Pensions, which is very exciting. Before I hand over to Johnny, I'm going to do a small bit of housekeeping. Just so that if you are a first timer, you know the deal. The first thing to let you know is that we record these calls. Lots of you register, but not everyone can join us live, and recording them allows us to put it on YouTube for those members who couldn't join us in person to catch up in their free time afterwards. So if you do not want to be recorded, you are able to turn your video off. You go down to the bottom left of most screens, and apologies if your technology is different to mine, and there's a stop video button. And that means that we won't see your face and that you won't be included in any recording. In theory, if you're just watching, you won't be shown up in the recording. Me or whoever's speaking at the time will be. So if you're asking a question later, there's a chance that you'll be included. But if you're not asking a question, chances are you won't be seen. And the other thing to let you know is that you will notice that you are muted. I'm going to keep you muted. It's not that I'm not interested in what you have to say. It's just that it's very hard to hear the speaker when we've got 101 of you with cars in the background or doors slamming or partners bringing cups of tea. So please do keep yourself muted. We will have time for questions later, and I can unmute you as host. So don't you worry about having to do that. And if it wouldn't be a Zoom call with an awkward "can you hear me?" So I'm sure that we will manage that later. In order to ask a question, there are a number of ways you can do that. Thank you to those of you who have already emailed myself or my colleague Izzy with some questions in advance of the call. I have them on my screen. You can also use the chat function. If you go to the bottom of your screen, there's a chat. You're able to say hello. So hello, Mariana, who has logged in and sent a message already. Fabulous. You can write to me with any questions or queries, or if you're having technological problems, or you can write to the Co-operative Party, which is the B picture behind which my colleague Izzy is hiding, ready to help you. Or you can put a hand up. I can't see all of the videos at once, so if you put your hand up in real life, I might not spot you, but if you go to the bottom of your screen, there is a participate button, and it allows you to put up a virtual hand. It does a little blue hand symbol and shows up on my screen that you want to ask a question. If you haven't used it before, you're very welcome to give it a test now, and I won't call on you, so you don't need to worry. You're also welcome to use the reactions button, a thumbs up or a round of applause, if you want to let us know what you're thinking. That's great. And I think that's most of it. We're going to try and keep this sort of 30 to 40 minutes. We'll hear from Johnny first, and then we will open it up for questions in threes. Make sure you stick your hand up nice and early so that I've got you on my list. And so without any further ado, if you are ready, Johnny, I will unmute you and hand straight over. Nice to see you.
Hi everyone, and thank you, Anna. I hope you can hear me. It's a bit like when you start off in the virtual parliament arrangements, you've got to make sure you don't want to start speaking and have those people gesticulate you and say, I'm sorry, we can't hear you, you're still on mute. But I'm really touched to see over 100 colleagues from the cooperative movement join me at lunchtime. It's really nice to be able to join you here from Stalybridge and just say a little bit about the team and what we're working on at the moment and what we're going to be working on over the next few months and years. I always start off in the chats I've been having with members, with colleagues across the Labour and Trade Union and cooperative movement by saying, I recognise that this brief is one where members have a particular interest. I think after the NHS, it's the issues that the Department of Work and Pensions cover that really do have a lot of interest from activists and supporters and colleagues in. And I really welcome that. I really welcome the expertise that comes with that. I welcome the political support for the kind of things that I want to be doing in this brief that comes with that. And also, in circumstances like we're facing at the minute, it's been a source of a huge amount of intelligence in terms of people's personal experiences of how the system, social security system, has been working during the crisis. A lot of people working in job centre pluses and places like that have been able to say about what has been going well and what hasn't. And it's a tremendous thing to have a sense that there are so many people out there who are engaged and interested in following what we're doing, but also there to support us. So a big thank you for all of that. I just want to say at the beginning, I have a great team. It's not just me. I have a great new team in the department, Shadow Department of Work and Pensions. Seema Malhotra is my Shadow Employment Minister. Vicky Foxcroft is my Shadow Minister for Disabled People. Kate Green is the Shadow Minister for Child Poverty, shadowing Will Quince, who's the Universal Credit Lead for the government. And Jack Dromey has stayed on as the Shadow Pensions Minister. And at the same time, Tomnia Antonuzzi is my PPS. So it's a fantastic thing to be able to work with such a good group of colleagues in my team, and such a good group of colleagues, to be honest, across the Shadow Cabinet, particularly my friend and colleague who we worked together, fellow Co-operative MP in the Shadow Treasury team, becoming the Shadow Chancellor, has been fantastic. You might know that the Department of Work and Pensions spends about a quarter of everything that the government spends. So if you haven't got a good relationship with your Chancellor or Shadow Chancellor, you're probably not going to be able to get through much of what you want. I'm going to split these opening remarks into two bits, really just a quick word on what we're doing in the crisis and what we're going to be doing next. And then, of course, just a few words on the longer term policy priorities that we've got, because I know there'll be a lot of interest in that. To start with, to take over a job like this, during a crisis like this, is a particular responsibility. You will have seen the sheer number of increased universal credit claims that have come in, and that's alongside another 250,000 new applications for job seekers allowance. We've never seen figures like this in this country's history, a growth that fast. And when you look at that alongside the success of the furlough scheme and the support for self-employed people, there are clearly holes in those packages, particularly around the dates that they apply to. But they have clearly encompassed a lot of people. To have that degree of support and still have so many people who are having to be supported directly by the social security system tells you really the scale of the human stories that is going on right now. And I say at the outset, I think the government, in terms of what they have done, have recognised that this country did not have a social security system that was fit for purpose going into this crisis. So there's lots of things I'd like them to do, but I do recognise that they increased the core amount, for instance, of universal credit by £1,000 a year, that they suspended the minimum income floor for self-employed people in universal credit. They have essentially suspended the sanctions and conditionality of the system going forward, not retrospective, but going forward, and just simply focused on processing claims. So they've effectively said, we've looked at this and this will not get us through the crisis. Now, if you are, for instance, saying that universal credit should quite rightly be more generous during lockdown, I see no logic to how you could then say it should be less generous when lockdown's over and the normal cost of living applies. And I think that's a good thing, because I think what this country needs is a social security system that's fit for purpose. And the fact that the government themselves seem to acknowledge that what we had wasn't fit for purpose, it's not a bad starting point to continue from. The 5 things we would like the government to do immediately are all things that we believe could be done quickly, efficiently, would make a big difference to people's lives. I think that's the right focus during a crisis. You will hopefully know that we've said, for instance, that we believe legacy benefits should be increased alongside that increase in universal credit. So I see no argument why job seekers allowance and ESA should not be brought up to the same level as universal credit. Now, the government say that's a technical problem, they just can't do it. I don't think we should be satisfied with that explanation. That's not good enough for me when it's people's lives being directly affected. But it's also worth saying that the government, on other things we've asked for, like ending the 5-week wait on universal credit, have said that isn't technically possible either. So they're saying the legacy system isn't fit for purpose, it can't be changed quickly, but the current system isn't flexible enough either. And we just can't be satisfied with that kind of explanation. The other 3 things we've asked for are the savings thresholds to be suspended. You will know there is a very tight means test around all of universal credit. And for instance, if you were saving up for something, if you had a disability and it was a substantial item you needed to purchase, or you were saving for a car or a housing deposit, you'd probably be excluded in quite a significant way from universal credit. And we don't think that's satisfactory. The other things are the end of the 2-child limit and the suspension of the benefit cap. They're both things that make a big difference to people's lives. There are now about 100,000 families in this country affected by the benefit cap. So just to be clear, they're being assessed for a level of support that the state believes they need and are entitled to under the current system, but then having that cap depending on where they live, obviously a more generous cap for London than the rest of the country. But really they go to the heart of some of the arguments we've had about social security over the last few years. So obviously the argument for the 2-child limit is the government saying, if you're in any way in receipt of social security benefits, you should be subject to the same choices around your family as everybody else. Now, first of all, let me say I have 4 children, and if you think the child element of universal credit will cover the cost of a child, I think most people in that situation knows that isn't true. But equally, how could you have been expected, for instance, to make a decision about the size of your family 3 years ago, predicated on the chances of a global pandemic shutting down your job, your sector, maybe for quite a significant period of time? You can't. And so not only is this a chance to say the system we've got at the minute isn't fit for purpose and it needs to change, I hope it's a chance to address some of the language and the way we've talked about social security in this country over the last few years, because I think that is integral to getting a much better system out of this. Now, when we look to the future, at the heart of what we're going to do is try and design and get political support for and implement that new social security system. Labour is still committed to replacing universal credit. I interpret universal credit as being very much about the core features that you will appreciate: the 5-week wait, the very much a sanctions and conditionality based regime. We were a pathfinder for a universal credit in my area many years ago. The core problems we found with that pathfinder were never addressed: the big increase in housing arrears, the big push in terms of the people dependent on food banks as a result of what was then the 6-week wait has become the 5-week wait, but the core problem still remains. And the message, because I'm getting asked a lot of times, for instance, about what is our policy on things like UBI, is really this: look, we want to design a completely new and effective social security system. I'm not ruling anything out at this stage. I'm willing to listen to evidence from around the world, from this country, for whatever people think are things that are working well, because every system around the world right now is being tested. There are many different elements of any social security system. We've always had actually some element of what is technically a form of UBI in this country, which is child benefit, up until it was stopped for higher earners under the coalition government. So we've always had a significant aspect of universality in it. I think if you look at where the government has got to on the whole system, I see it in really 3 significant components. You've got universal credit, with housing benefit, support for children, tax credits, out of work support, disability support, all put into universal credit with a very tight ring fence around it, with some outcomes that I don't think any of us are happy with. You've still got alongside that the sort of contributory element of it. If you are, for instance, ineligible for universal credit because you have savings or earnings that mean you can't receive that in your household, you still can claim, for instance, contributory job seekers allowance, but that's a very small part of the system now, and actually very few people even bother to claim that because they either see themselves as going into universal credit in normal times, or they just don't bother to get that in that situation. And then you've got disability benefits, particularly the transition from DLA to PIP, something my own son has actually just been through very recently, with some major problems around the work capability assessment and, frankly, how many decisions are overturned on appeal by tribunal, a system that needs looking at as well. So we need to look at all of those aspects, and we want to talk to people with views on that, ideas on that, and evidence and best practice around the world. Alongside that, we want to very much return to having an ambitious child poverty strategy. Now, the last Labour manifesto was very progressive in terms of the package that we proposed, but let's be clear, we were still talking then about how we could reduce the increase in the numbers of children living in poverty in this country. There are 4 million children living in poverty in the UK, and all things being equal, that will rise to 5 million by 2023, 2024. There's no dispute over that. That's the Resolution Foundation and the IFS both identify those figures. And there's no dispute anymore really about what child poverty is. You might remember there was a time where, particularly when Ian Duncan Smith was coming to prominence in the Conservative Party around this agenda, there was a suggestion that the poverty shouldn't be defined in terms of incomes. It should be much more about family breakdown and things like that. Actually, if you look at where the other side, if you like, got to on that journey, they ended up in a position with the creation of the Social Metrics Commission, where they basically said, look, income is the main determinant of poverty. It might seem obvious to us because clearly the definition of poverty relates to a person's income relative to the rest of the society that they live in. But actually that wasn't consensus for a while, and now it is again. Now, I don't think there is a government strategy on child poverty. I don't think there is, frankly, an acknowledgement of the numbers of people living in working households who are now in poverty. And we want to get back to a position where we are saying this is the route map for a country that does not have child poverty. in a significant way. We're not reducing the increase, but the elimination of child poverty. I think that is possible. I think that should be at the heart of what we are doing. Specifically on disability benefits, there's so much pain and frustration and distrust of the way that disability benefits have treated people over the last few years. And I acknowledge that. We need to overhaul the work capability assessment. This is an area that needs a lot of consultation and support from members on, because there's obviously in some quarters a desire for a much more medically led process as part of that. But at the same time, disability is not a medical thing. It's about society. It's about the society that we live in and how we treat people within it and how we enable people to live their lives within that. So there is no straightforward way, I think, to say, look, this is how that system should look like. But we have to recognise, simply from that point of view on the number of appeals that we're receiving, it has to change and it can be done in a better way. A final note on pensions, because often in this brief, the social security system quite rightly takes a lot of the focus, and maybe the pensions becomes a secondary issue. But look, I am and always have been interested in ownership. And if you're a member of the Co-op Party, you're probably interested in ownership too. I'm always interested in the power of capital, how it shapes jobs and how it shapes the economy, and how you can change that and direct it to the kind of ends that we all would support as members of the co-op movement. It is often forgotten that working people in this country have vast amounts of capital in their names. It's their pension funds. And how you put those pension funds to the benefit of wider society is in many ways one of the most radical agendas of all. And I think there's a lot that can be done if you look at other countries, and I'm particularly interested in Australia, how the labour movement there in Australia has power over vast amounts of capital and can use that for the kind of ends that we would all want to see. We don't have a pension system like that in this country. We've started on that route in a way with auto-enrolment and organisations like the People's Pension and Nest, but they're not on that scale. So I want, in terms of our pensions agenda, yes, of course, I want pensions that are adequate and support people having a dignified and happy, prosperous retirement. I want that system to be sustainable and to cover the whole population. But I think there's also an agenda there about how you link people to the wider economy, give them power again over their own lives, and have a say in some of the very big interactions that go on in an economy of our scale to promote the kind of ends that we live in. There's a book called The Rise of the Working Class Shareholder, which is actually by an American academic. But he points out in a lot of developed countries around the world, it's entirely feasible for a person to be employed in an industry and putting aside significant pension savings that are then deployed in investment terms in the wider economy to undermine the job and the occupation and the sector that that person works in. That is absurd. So I think that could be interesting. I think it could be radical. I think that would be something of huge interest to all members of our party and movement. But look, I feel I've spoken for a while, so let me end there. Looking forward to some questions, and again, really grateful to all of you for joining us this lunchtime from Stalybridge.
Fabulous. So thank you very much, Johnny. That was wide-ranging, and it shows in the number of questions I've had through while you were talking. I've got a long list. I'm going to try and get through everybody, but please be forgiving if I don't manage to get onto your question. My inbox is always open, policy@party.coop, and I am sure that Johnny would be very happy for us to forward sort of queries and issues through, so that he's got a feel for what the Co-op Party membership is thinking and worrying about. I am going to kick off with a question from Naz Asgar, who has asked me to read it out for him. I've seen you've emailed me again, Naz. I'm going to start with your first one, if that's okay. He says that the lockdown has shown that self-employed businesses, even those where people work from home, are a huge proportion of the workforce and the economy. Going forward, are there any plans to form policy around giving full rights to the self-employed on a par with employee rights, such as entitlement to benefits, holidays, parental leave, and for the larger trade unions to be fully engaged with and available for the self-employed? So the self-employed furlough scheme is a good example of the disparity that currently exists. So quite a meaty one around self-employment there. I will unmute John O'Connor for our next one. Let me just find you, John, who I must say, if you don't know about the Cooperative Schools Network, you should check out. John is their director, but has a question not about schools. John.
Thanks, yeah. The question really was looking at the fallout from the pandemic, which is huge, particularly in our area where I'm living in Folkestone in Kent, but many other towns and cities. And really it was looking at what is the view that Jonathan would take on opportunities to encourage linked to the last question, I suppose, the opportunities for development of cooperatives, not-for-profits, in order to find a number of ways of supporting employment for the serious numbers of people who are going to be displaced as a consequence of the lockdown, economic shock and so on, which is unfolding.
Great. And the third in this round, Jill, I think you've emailed a question in about WASPy women. I will unmute you now. Are you there, Jill?
Yeah, I am. Hi.
Great. Hello.
Hi. Yeah, I had the question. It's really regarding the resolution by Labour's John McDonnell and Jeremy Corbyn's approval, well, pre the election in 2019, to sort out a fair 5-year strategy for compensating 3.8 million women born in the 1950s who have been denied their pensions at 60, 63 and 65. We've had to wait 6 years. Would there be any mitigation for the failure by successive governments not addressing this tragedy soon enough? And what's going to happen to all the pensioners, well, the pensions that the women who will never get because they've possibly died through the COVID pandemic, and what will happen to that money? So I'd be interested in hearing if the Shadow Cabinet will help, and there's co-operators like Sir Keir Starmer, Angela Rayner, Lady Angela Smith, Baroness of Buston, who all back the WASPy campaign. Been wondering whether they've made any provision for this despicable injustice.
Thank you very much, Jill. Right, that's 3 massive areas for you to get started on. So I will, if you're on mute and you want to crack into some of those.
Thanks, Anna, and thanks, Naz, John, and Jill for those fantastic questions. Let me start in the order they came, Anna. So, Naz, your question about self-employed businesses, the structure of how people are employed, it is one of the major issues facing this country. So I think what you have seen in the lockdown, in particular because of eligibility for those support packages, is just how, first of all, the government itself has a poor grip of the diversity of how people are employed and how they go about their working lives in the UK right now. And actually a fairly, I think, unjust assessment from the government as to eligibility around support and the role they play in the economy. So in particular, obviously, you have the furlough scheme, like you say, for PAYE employees. You've had a self-employed package, and there's been this big gap of people who are broadly called limited companies, but they're the directors. They obviously pay themselves a salary and a level of dividends that come through that. Now, particularly on that latter group, the government's view is those people paid in that way don't pay significant levels of national insurance, not eligible for support. Now, if you're in that position, you will know if you're paying corporation tax and then dividend tax on the money that you're receiving in that way, you're probably paying actually a substantial level of tax. I mean, you could have to look at the precise circumstances of each one in that. Right? I don't think people operating in that way have set about themselves in some sort of elaborate, tax avoidance scheme. It's just that has become a very significant way that people work in the UK because we have different ways and different tax regimes for different people. Now, I think the discrepancy in employment support, unemployment support and wider benefits is just a massive issue. Now, you will have seen in the crisis, we, for instance, called for statutory sick pay to apply to everybody. We've talked about the difference, for instance, between maternity allowance and statutory maternity pay under the universal credit regulations. But in terms of policy going forward, and this links to John's question, as I say, I want to be the Secretary of State for Work and Pensions, covering the Social Security system, the pension system, but also the world of work. And this is something that Annalisa Dodds, the Shadow Chancellor, and Ed Miliband, as the Shadow Business Secretary, is also really focused on. That conversation about, because I can't just design a social security system in one corner, and expect that to work. You can't have a system that, for instance, just props up low wages or a dysfunctional housing market. You've got to link that together. And I know from my own constituency just how important it is for people who work in the kind of ways that you described, what a role they play in the economy, and frankly, how much we will need those people in the recovery. So yes, we want to do a bit of work. That'll be a big part of what Labour's about going forward. That is about how do you make work good in terms of the existing employment patterns we've got, but also how do you expand, the safety net? What is the reasonable level of money people should pay into the system, and what should they get out of that as a result. So yes, the kind of question you're talking about, the kind of people not covered at the minute, and will they be covered in future? Yes, that is absolutely on not just my agenda, but the whole of the Shadow Cabinet's agenda. We will be, the next major thing we're obviously looking at is not just about the support for people in the crisis, but what's the route out of the crisis. And we know, for instance, I'm afraid there's no other way to describe this. Unemployment is going to be significantly higher than it was going into the crisis, because some sectors aren't open to the same degree, and unfortunately some businesses have gone under. And that return to work package is going to have to look at not just how we get places like Job Centre Pluses back at helping get people back into jobs, but about, for young people in particular, do we need to guarantee them a job like we did after the financial crisis for a period of time to make sure they're not scarred by unemployment? And what kind of organisations, linking to John's question, can get people adequately back into work in the best way forward? So yes, all of that, I promise you, is on our agenda. Jill, a different kind of question about WASPI, but a really good one again. I've personally always been, like the people you mentioned, a supporter of the WASPI campaign. I recognise from my own constituency particular cases where, for instance, there's a woman who's been, she's entered the labour market at a time in her life when there wasn't equal pay. It was often an employment market of significant discrimination. People have then taken choices to leave the labour market, perhaps to look after grandchildren, or they've done the midlife choices expecting their pension to happen at a certain time. And I know as a result of that, there has been significant hardship. I recognise the offer that we made. Again, I was part of the Shadow Treasury team that put forward that 2019 offer, backfired in a way. It wasn't seen, well, it didn't land in the way that we wanted it to be frank. People thought it wasn't realistic. I still am determined that there will be a part of our policy platform that addresses this. I'm obviously, I'm aware of the dates, and I'm aware of the fact that having lost the 2019 election, you then expect one in, say, 2024, and just there's a cohort of women who will then have already received their pension. So I'm totally aware that the landscape has changed, but I still think on the timescale we've got, there will be some women who are not yet in receipt of anything, and I'm determined for women like that who are in destitution or really difficult circumstances, that we will still be recognising and addressing that need. It's obviously early stages of a parliament, so I don't have that policy exactly agreed, but I can promise you we haven't forgotten about this, and many of us still retain strong support and sympathy and understanding of the situation.
Fabulous. Are you ready for the next round?
No problem.
Great. So I am going to unmute Jacqueline first with a question on childcare. Oh, Jacqueline. I think there we go.
Sorry, I think we were at cross purposes there.
Don't you worry.
I am one of the women whose pension has been put off considerably, so thank you to the colleague who said about that. I was one of the last generation who had the option to stay out of the workplace and look after my children. I had 4 children, and because of the lockdown, I wonder if the attitude towards the value of childcare, both having the opportunity to look after your children and the value of people who look after children for you, which has previously been seen as not having much status, but as people have been without it for nearly 3 months, I wonder how people are now valuing the idea of childcare. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I will mute you again, and then I was going to ask Adebayo. I will unmute you, and thank you for patiently having your hand up.
Thank you. Thank you for giving me this opportunity. It is, I've been in the third sector. Actually, I'm from the North London Borough of Enfield, and I've worked in the third sector for about 3 decades now. And as we all know, the third sector look after and address and help intervene when we talk about poverty, child poverty, and many other poverty-related issues. What are we going to do about that? And as we see, the talk sector is not included in some of the support the government are giving widely as an employer. Talk sector also employ a large number of people within this. And so those are the things that needs to be addressed as well if we're going to talk about poverty. and the root cause of poverty, as opposed to us constantly dealing with the causation. We should also look at the root and then look at it in a parallel way, put the strategy forward to address it going forward together.
Fabulous, thank you. And the third one in this round, I have Christopher. You had a question about disability employment.
Oh, I don't my question.
We can hear you, I think.
Oh, hi there. I didn't
Hello.
know I'd be speaking in person.
Oh, sorry. Would you like me to?
No, it's no problem.
Perfect. All right.
So disability employment has stagnated, and Remploy factories helped with this for many decades. It led to disabled people being warehoused away from the mainstream employment market. Some countries have quotas in place to ensure that people with learning disabilities make up a larger proportion of the workforce. What can Labour do in the future to make this happen here?
Fabulous. And then just as a heads up, I've had a deluge of questions about UBI, so be aware that we will be having another round of questions, and it will enable us to have maybe a detailed chat about UBI before we let you disappear, Johnny, if that's all right.
Great, no, lovely, that sounds great. Jacqueline, lovely question. And as you were saying it, I was reminded, I think somebody, I can't remember who it was, tweeted about sort of a day into the lockdown that having tried to educate their kids from home, they now believe teachers should earn sort of £1 million an hour. And I think a few of us, I don't know whether you can hear in the background, it's a lively day in the Reynolds household as well here. I think there's a whole range of workers, a whole range of jobs and roles that people have now, perhaps because of the situation in the lockdown and the wider situation in the economy, the crisis, have a respect or understanding of that they didn't have the same degree. I mean, I think most of us on the left would certainly, didn't need a crisis like this to recognise the key contribution of a lot of our key workers. But, in wider society, let's acknowledge that I think perhaps that is the case. There are so many, this question about the jobs for the future, which we just touched on in the previous round, and the state of the world and global competition, and people often, they're often pessimistic about the future, and yet there are sectors that we know we will need in the UK that at the minute, whether it's social care or the childcare sector more generally, we know we could be doing much more on. We know these are sectors that need higher levels of pay, better conditions for people. We know as a society we need to spend more on these things. I think that's particularly the case with social care. And yes, I do think, that you couldn't in any way say there are good things about a crisis like this, given the toll that the country and the world has suffered. But you can, I think, within that acknowledge that yes, it has changed perceptions of something. It's like this perception of the whole social security system has changed, where people who perhaps never thought they themselves would be in need of support are now looking at it and thinking, actually, I'm thinking about this differently. I think that's true of sectors like the ones you've described, and I think we've got to build on that. I don't think you get a magic wand when you get moments like this, but I think it gives you a chance to be heard in a different way, a chance to put different arguments, and I think this is a chance to do that, and that's why the responsibility of a job like mine after this crisis and during it is so profound and serious. Adebayo, a brilliant question about child poverty. You said, what are we going to do about it? Well, we are going to produce and give you and involve you in something that you will feel proud of, that you will recognise will make a difference, and that when you are knocking on a door for a Labour and Co-op candidate, or maybe knocking on a door for yourself in the next round of elections, and someone says to you, well, would it make any difference? And you can say, yes, it would. And by the way, without any hesitation, the poorest in this society will benefit if we put in a Labour government, and these are the measures that will do that. You mentioned a particularly crucial point, which is about causation. Look, I mean, I'll be clear. I think there's a moral case for tackling child poverty. I think it's unconscionable that we could, as a society, be heading towards 5 million children growing up in poverty, most of them in working households. And I think if you compare where we're at, even within Europe, we're a real outlier on this. We're not in the mainstream. Ireland and the UK are real outliers in terms of the number of children who grow up in poverty. We make it quite a bit better with our existing social security system, but not enough. And we've got to make an argument against that. A lot of you will be involved in local government or charities or co-ops who are working in a space where you're dealing with the consequences of that kind of child poverty. I look as I represent an area that only has one council, it's Tameside Council, which I used to be a member of. What we spend on children's social services, the costs that go into the system, the costs of educational failure and deprivation, if you take away that moral case, there is a pretty rational case for dealing with this in a much better way. So, yep, it's going to be central to it. I don't just want to hand it down from the shadow cabinet, though. I want to be doing calls like this. I want to be going out and talking to local government, trade unions, cooperatives about the best way to do that. But I recognise at the top of that, it requires a Labour Secretary of State, Labour and Cooperative Secretary of State, making decisions about some of the big parts of our system, because let's be honest, without the right social security system, you cannot tackle this in the way that you want and I want it. That isn't possible. This has to be part of it. Let's not pretend there isn't, there is a way where you don't have the changes that we want to see and you get the outcomes that we want. But that is definitely part of it. Christopher, again, a smashing question about disability employment. It's something really close to my heart. My son has autism. He is 17 now. You worry a lot about it. I wish I had a very clearly worked out plan and route map to that. But again, I don't think we do well as a country compared to other countries. I think there's lots we can learn from other places. It's a sensitive area sometimes to talk about when you are a politician with my job, because there are some people, if you talk about disability employment, come back and say, that's completely wrong. Some people need support. They'll never be able to work. And that's right. I think there's a significant chance my son is in that category. And other people, if you talk about that, will come back and say, it's patronising. We want the chance to be in the workplace, exactly as you said, not segregated off in the workplace. So you've got to recognise that scale. I mean, I always talk about that, particularly in relation to autism. You've got to understand the scale. There's no, these people need this. You've got to understand that it's about enabling people to be able to go into the workplace, perhaps with a little bit of extra support, but also making clear that for people who will never be able to support themselves, we'll be there as a society to look after them, to give them the support they need, to let them live in dignity and comfort. And I don't think, to be honest, we always do that in this country. So there are two sides to that. I'm going to be going out and finding out what I think will work. And yes, again, that'll be a big part of our policy platform.
Great. So sort of, I think we've had far more questions than I'm going to be able to get through all of. So I just want to, where I've had a few on the same topic, I might sum up on people's behalf. So housing has been something that's come up a lot. Yeah. We've had John, Sean, Raven, Jagia all asking questions from different angles around housing, concerns around housing benefit caps, around the rising cost of renting, the protections for renters, particularly as we come out of lockdown. And Sean asked a question from a social housing perspective, and that the definition of affordable housing doesn't join up with the housing benefits that you get to be able to afford it, and that there's a mismatch there. So I guess a question about what do we do about people in insecure and expensive housing, and how are you working with colleagues in the Shadow Cabinet to develop that thinking so it's more joined up. UBI, I think the question that A was shortest, but B summed up everyone's concerns came from Cynthia. So if you're all right, Cynthia, I will unmute you to ask about UBI.
Okay.
Hiya.
Okay, thank you. I can't put my video on. Oh, I have done quickly.
Yeah.
Sorry about that. Yes, it was just about universal basic income. I suppose what I'm aware of is the arts sector. People who don't even make a profit, but do something that society wants, and they just are falling by the wayside. But I think there's a much more general and fundamental reason to go for a universal basic income. Thank you.
Fabulous. I am going to ask, I'm going to do two more. I'm going to squeeze in 4 for this round, because I think you'll be able to cover them in some summing up, if that's all right. Mariana, and it's not just because she's a counsellor with me in Lambeth, there's no bias, but it's a good question, so I will let you ask.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Anna. Thanks, Jonathan. I wanted to obviously ask a question about the fact that COVID has really shone a light on structural inequalities, and from my perspective, particularly sort of racial issues. I'm a woman of 50 who's been made redundant 3 times. I'm very aware that from a BAME perspective, you have to apply on average 70 to 90% more than white applicants to receive just an interview. So I'm just interested to know, obviously we're facing the biggest crisis possible in terms of unemployment, what policies or thoughts you have on BAME recruitment, and should we do eventually get jobs, what you'll do to address the fact that on average we earn 37% less than white counterparts.
Thank you, Mariana. And last but by no means least, Jeff Walker, I will unmute you for your question, and then we'll hand over to Johnny to wrap up for us. I'm trying to unmute you, Jeff. I think you might have to do something at your end. If not, I can read your question out for you, as I thought it was a worthwhile one to ask. Let me find where it is. So it's a question about what's your strategy for dealing with young people who are NEET, so not in employment, education or training. So as well, you know, we touched on lots of demographics that are going to be particularly impacted by this. We've got a lot of young people who'll be should be entering the workforce as we come out of lockdown who possibly won't be. And then if you want to sort of wrap those up into some closing remarks, we'll let you disappear and eat your lunch.
That's sorry. Can you hear me okay? So we're unmuting each other. Listen, again, terrific questions. Let me start and talk about, actually, let me take Cynthia's UBI question to begin with, because then that links into some of the other issues. Now, people will know, in terms of members of the parliamentary, Labour Party, Labour Co-op colleagues, I am someone who is sympathetic to UBI. I wrote when I was on the back benches between prevent jobs last time that I thought this was something we needed to consider the arguments around. And I'll tell you what has always appealed to me. First of all, simplicity, because I think people need to understand the system. I think you build consent for any kind of public service if people think it'd be there for them. Second of all, you know, I have witnessed throughout my life, especially as a constituency MP, that actually a lot of problems in the system come from situations where people transition from out of work to going back into work and then maybe back out again. And actually, people often frame UBI, the concern is often people won't do any work, they'll just kind of sit at home. Well, actually, the biggest problem of any out of work support package is if you withdraw other benefits, particularly housing support, as you go back into the workplace, you can create that disincentive. That's what the taper rate of universal credit is. It's basically what you save out of every pound you earn going back to do additional hours in the workplace. And historically, what this country has done to deal with that problem is end up getting a system which is more and more compulsory, more and more coercive. So in other words, because you can't incentivize people to increase their hours at work or go back into the workplace, you end up forcing them through a fairly tough regime. And I think that has undermined support for the whole thing. So I think there are things in UBI that we have to look at, that we have to acknowledge are strong arguments. I said in that article I wrote in support of it, Cynthia, I recognise as someone who's sympathetic, there are two major problems. First of all, housing, because the UK has such a dysfunctional housing market where, you know, clearly property in some parts of this country is just on a multiple of the average that it's almost, you know, to me as someone living here in Staley Bridge, unbelievable how anyone even gets on that property market. But how you deal with that when it's so differential across the country is a problem. And the second point is, how do you make sure people who have a disability and can never go back into the labour market, how do they get adequate levels of support? If you're giving something to everyone, how is it enough for people who really do have a very specific need? But I think it is an argument that we have to be aware of and engaged in and interested in. And as I say, any system of social security combines different elements to it. And I think there is a very strong argument for an element of universality. Now, as I say, we've had that in a way historically with child benefit, but I do think there are things in this that we have to look at. That problem with housing links to the very good questions we also had about housing generally. Now, at the beginning of the crisis, the government increased the housing benefit element of universal credit to restore it back to the 30th percentile. In other words, a third of average housing costs. The fact that it had fallen below a third means it was actually incredibly low at that stage. Now, we have said, and obviously I work very closely with my housing colleagues who are in the main Tangham Debonair, who's our Shadow Secretary of State for Housing, that the government needs to look at restoring that to the 50th percentile as it was in the past, because that would be average housing costs. Now, the way that local housing allowance works, in terms of what is available, say my family needed support and what we would get under local housing allowance here in Tameside, it's certainly not generous, but it would actually be enough, certainly would be enough in a social home. In other parts of the country, it wouldn't at all. Those challenges of housing and how you then have a system of social security that covers adequately what people need, whichever way you look at it, you come back to a need to have a substantial increase in the number of social properties in this country. I mean, there is no other way to try and meet the needs that we've got, given the differential in housing costs around the country, unless you have a substantial bank of social properties to look at. And when I talk about how the system itself cannot just be about supporting a dysfunctional housing market or topping up low wages in the labour market, that really takes you back to the heart of it. And that's why doing this job in conjunction with such good colleagues across the Shadow Cabinet is so important, but also I think the only way you get to the kind of policies that we all want to see. Mariana, with a tremendous question about structural inequality. Now, I agree. I don't think, and I thought this from the beginning, when people say we're all in this together, that isn't true. This has been the most vivid illustration of inequality, in the sense of there are people who can be at home, working from home on laptops on full pay. There are people who have been forced to go back into work really in a way they don't feel is safe and aren't happy with. There have been people who've lost their jobs or seen, I think the biggest losers in a way are actually people who haven't lost their jobs but have had such a reduction in hours and they can't be furloughed if they're still working. But it's not shown us that because we knew they were there, but the spotlight perhaps it's put on it. Again, the awareness that has increased as a result is a big part of this crisis. And you specifically mentioned the BAME impact of this. On your point, particularly around BAME recruitment. Now, actually, we had this discussion, or I did this discussion with some colleagues just yesterday, because I was interviewing yesterday for the new General Secretary of the Labour Party. And actually, we were talking about the fact that within, the officers, the staff that we have as a party, we have, a lack of representation there. We have to address this internally as well as have the right policies for the country. I'm learning a lot about this. There are some things we talked about then, like name blind applications and things like that I think we need to look at. But I think it goes back to that question we had a few rounds ago about how you reset and change employment and what is good work in this country, how you set standards for the work we've already got and the standard that needs to meet, and how you then change the conversation in sectors where they're new sectors or we know that they're not high performing in terms of the quality of jobs and what people need. And actually that message about how we will make work good and fulfilling, not just in an income sense, but in terms of the wider responsibilities and fulfillment people have at work, that is going to be a big part of what we do. Finally, Jeff, your question on NEET, which I can't forget because for some reason, Jeff, my screen is just fixed on you. I don't want to embarrass you, but I've been looking at you while I answer all of these questions, so you've been on my mind. When I talk about the next bit of work we're doing, being about the recovery and the way out of it, the impact on young people who would otherwise have moved into jobs or training, it is paramount in our concerns. We know that certainly the impact of this crisis generally has been one that has been incredibly hard for older groups, particularly people in care homes. But in terms of the economic impacts, we know that young people who face in a recession a significant period out of work or training bear those scars for many years to come. Every recession we've ever had in the UK has given us an element of that. And actually the response that we had after the financial crisis, you might remember it was called the Future Jobs Fund, and then the guarantee for young people that encompassed a few different programs as well. Actually, that was a good thing. The coalition scrapped it early because it said people didn't go into full-time jobs. The purpose of a scheme like that is to keep people in something rather than nothing during the crisis. That's the metric of success. So we're looking very closely at that. I'm talking personally to the people who designed and implemented that scheme after the financial crisis and other things like it. So it's very much in our concerns, and it's not just something about the recovery from the crisis, but also more generally, because clearly the same issues apply. If people are NEET and they're out of employment or training for significant periods of time when they're young, it has such a disproportionate impact on their lives that it has to be a very big priority.
Well, I think we've kept Johnny for long enough. Andrew Neil, eat your heart out. The Cooperative Party is the place to come for a grilling. And thank you very much to everybody who asked a question who we haven't been able to hear from. I've saved the chat and also the ones that you sent to Izzy on the Cooperative Party. So I'll be writing those up and make sure that they land in Johnny's inbox, so he knows the kinds of issues that Co-op Party members and you represent communities all across the country. So the issues that you're most concerned about, and we've had some really interesting ideas come through as well about how you design in different versions of a UBI policy, and all sorts of suggestions as well. So I'm sure that they will be gratefully received. I will call today to a halt. Those of you who are councillors, and I spot a handful of you, don't forget we have a 6 p.m. call as well. I think we have Georgia Gould coming on, who is the leader of Camden Council, which will be very interesting. And with that, I will ask you all to look after yourselves, stay safe, stay at home if you're able to, and to enjoy whatever good weather you've got in your neck of the woods. And thank you very much. Thank you, Johnny.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you, everybody. Really good to see you.